once we became pioneers, you had to wear that red scarf. And they would put on the 1st of September a big sort of school parade or something. And they would do propaganda speeches, and everything that was going on in the country would always be reflected. Some teachers were more political than the others, but basically the history, especially the history of USSR, so-called, was so full of lies. We didn't know it at the time, but now it's quite clear what they were feeding us. And we were fed, of course, by all the films about the birth of Soviet Union, the whole myth about Prince Igor, Borodin's famous opera. Or Alexander Nevsky, a fabulous film, and also cantata later on from the music that Prokofiev wrote for that film. And it was based on lies, based on wrong facts. The whole thing was to make us feel that we live in the most wonderful paradise of workers. Communism is around the corner, and we are socialists, and everybody, should be like us. Of course, we were overfed by that. And there was a great deal of skepticism from little kids. I mean, just the very fact that we were attracted to listen to the Beatles, to the Western pop music, which was not allowed. The rock was not allowed. The jazz was not really allowed, but it was not as bad as the rock, which was considered decadent art of the West. That was right there. Then we were constantly singing and remembering the songs of the bards, Vysotsky, Okudjava, Vizbar, Galich. We would have 45 minutes lesson and 15-minute intermission. Right there in the class, as soon as the teacher left, one of the pianists would come to the piano and start playing those songs, and we would sing it. And we all knew those songs by heart. They were very anti-Soviet in one way or the other, whether it was connected with the criminal world, which was often the themes of Galich or Vysotsky. I'm Dmitry Sitkovetsky, violinist and conductor. You're listening to Keeping the Flame, a series about how one's life is shaped by family, by political system, and by great art, but not defined by any of them. And in this episode, I will tell you how I learned to beat that system. Most of us were so keen on getting to know what was not allowed. It was, in many ways, an effect of the forbidden fruit. Because of the environment I was growing up, I was not the only one who was from the musical family. We knew about the West a lot more than normal school children because our parents traveled. My mother traveled abroad, not excessively, but quite regularly. So she was able to bring, this what they called the hard currency certificates. So we could buy in those privileged Berezka shops. And when I was 16 years old, she bought me a beautiful turntable and the speakers. And I would hold listening sessions. I remember Jesus Christ Superstar when it came out, and I had considerable delegation in my room just listening to this and being, That was certainly a big event. Berezka's hard currency stores, I think they probably started after the war, when the artists or the scientists or the writers or whoever traveled abroad had the permission to obtain a certain amount of foreign currency for what they were doing. They couldn't buy anything with that foreign currency in Russia. That was not allowed. But they could buy at a certain fixed rate. They could buy those certificates. And with those, they could go to those Berezka stores with a special documentation, with passport and all this, and they could buy things there. And of course, some of those stories were quite dramatic, like the story of Misha Maisky, one of the most well-known cellists in the world. Misha Maisky was buying a tape recorder there in order to tape Rostropovich's lessons. But he didn't have the right because he hadn't been outside. And he got caught. It was a setup. And he served 1.5 years in not quite a gulag, but in a prison, kind of prison. He had to work near Nizhny Novgorod, near Gorky at that time. As everything in Soviet Union, if you knew how to play the game and played it safe or smart, you could benefit from this, because people, of course, would buy certain things in Berezka's store, and if they needed Russian rubles, they would sell it for much higher price in rubles, and then build themselves daches, buy cars, and so forth. There was plenty of that going on. But the one thing, of course, one overriding thing one learned from those, you had to learn how to beat the system very early on. In the West, it's a very different demarcation line, much more complex than in the Soviet Union used to be. It was very clear that you had a very small group of your family, if you trusted all the members or some members of your family, close friends, and the rest was people you would never speak your mind because you simply didn't know what happened. I had so many stories of people, the previous generation being put in gulag, in Stalin times for nothing, the anonymous letters to KGB, things like that. We were never that far from that, but Brezhnev years were less dangerous maybe to most of intelligentsia, obviously not all, but what I always felt that the generation of Stalin years, till 53, 1 year before I was born, they had actually physical fear running their veins. They were never safe. And they were sort of like, the anxiety of the Jews who always feel that there is another pogrom around the corner, so they can never really relax for thousands of years. It's been like this. So that was the situation during the Stalin terror. That I never experienced. My generation never felt physically so threatened. So we were much more daring, up to a point. We played always a double game. With the officials, we would not talk about it. We kept our mouths shut. But between ourselves, we always discussed politics, religion, philosophy. We all listened to Voice of America. We lived by that, by BBC and Voice of America and Radio Liberty. Those were the three voices of freedom that we heard. We used to read completely forbidden literature. All the sort of the most interested in the class would always get the latest Solzhenitsyn book. And that was quite dangerous to have. Solzhenitsyn was a math teacher who served a number of years in Gulag and who wrote Один день Ivan Denisovich, One Day of Ivan Denisovich, which became a huge sensation because it was published in a Soviet magazine with Khrushchev's permission. Then came different heads of Politburo party, and they changed he became a dissident, very well known in the West because all of his books were translated and published in the West, and therefore they didn't put him in prison, but they forced him out. They let him leave Soviet Union. And while we were, as students of Moscow Conservatory, were reading Solzhenitsyn voraciously, I mean, we would pass them on, the books wrapped in a newspaper, so you didn't see the cover. Of course, our classmates must have noticed, but not everybody were KGB reporters, so they sort of kept to themselves. We were also keenly aware of spying among our own. I know specifically who it was in my class who was reporting to the KGB on each one of us already by the 10th grade. So that's not exactly so comforting, but you learn how to dodge the bullet, so to speak. Usually the ones who came from provinces, from Kazakhstan, from Kazan, they were not as daring as the Muscovites because we knew the setup. And I remember a very tragic story of Yuri Egorov. Yuri Egorov was extremely gifted, a pianist who came from Kazan. That's the capital of Tatarstan, one of the Russian republics. People from Tartar lived there. So he came from there and got into Yakov Zak's class. In his first year, he was recruited against his will by KGB. When I found out, he was frightened to death because he was summoned to that particular building on Kachalova Street. And because he was not from Moscow, looked very innocent. And they said, well, you have to do your citizen's duty. You live in the dormitory. You'll be living with one of the foreign students. So we need to know what they talk about, their political beliefs, because we want to make sure that they're here not to do anything against us and so forth. So he told this to my best friend, to Yuri Rozum, who in turn told me that story. So I told that story to his teacher, Yakov Zak, that I was very close to. And he had a brilliant idea of how to diffuse that. He recalled his mother to Moscow from Kazan, and he told her exactly what to do. So he said, please go and make a hysterical scene to the head of Moscow Conservatory, to the president, Sveshnikov, and said, my son, just his first year in Moscow, he's frightened. Some people pretended to be KGB. They're bothering him. I'm going to the press. So they somehow, apparently they stopped bothering him, but he was frightened for life. And that was 72, 73. In 76, at the first possibility, he defected. Those stories, every other week there was something like that. What I mentioned previously, that in Russia was very clear demarcation. You had them and us. Them was any kind of authority. And it was not necessarily us against the older generation, which is very often and typical, in the Western world. But it was also older generation where we were, our parents or people that we know, they were quietly anti-Soviet anyway. We went to those, fantastic theater productions of Современник, of Taganka, and we all read between the lines. The great thing about Russian culture is that it always puts your spiritual life, your inner life, above the material. With situations, logically, it just doesn't make sense. But then there is something happens, completely illogical because of the human nature. And that's where the Dostoevsky shows up with a knife and turns everything upside down. And that's the part that fascinates the West, the mysterious Russian soul. It doesn't exist. But first and foremost is the state of your soul. And it's funny coming from the country where nobody really spoke the truth. Later on, when I was passing the exams, even the teachers sometimes were accomplices in passing the exams rather than making sure that I would fail it, because there's certain subjects I didn't want to learn. In Moscow Conservatory, I was straight A student. I became a Lenin stipendiat. And that was 100 rubles a month. It was basically a salary. But in order to get that, I had to go through ridiculous exams, of course. I would come in, I knew some of the teachers. There was Semyon Haskevich Rapoport, who was the head of the Department of Marxism Communism. But he knew my uncle, and he was very predisposed towards me, and he knew that I would not know anything. So he sent his counterpart, who was ready to kill me because she never saw me at any of the lessons. Go have a smoke. She said, well, I just smoked, Semyon Haskevich. Just go smoke again. So she went for 5 minutes. By the time she came back, I already had my marking, which was, the high marking. He never asked me anything. Even then, you had to become a bit of a con man. You use your connections to get through. You had to beat the system. At the same time, I also knew how demeaning the role of a Soviet artist was. My mother was a big star, not only in Soviet Union, but all those places where she went. But she depended very much on a particular bureaucrat in Ministry of Culture. And those people could make your life really miserable. And I knew that it was not just my mother, but the very top ones. Oyster had to report to the embassy or to the clerk, and he could tell him who to go see and who not to go see. So all of that affected us. And it was not somewhere, if we were somewhere in Siberia, Moscow and Leningrad is so far away. No, we were right there at the epicenter of all of that. Many of us were potential dissidents. When Rostropovich wrote his famous letter in defense of Solzhenitsyn, that was a big thing. That was already very close to home because I knew Rostropovich all my life. His daughters were studying in 2 years and 3 years younger than me. Rostropovich was one of the greatest Soviet musicians of the last century and beginning of the 21st century. He died in 2007. He really doubled, maybe tripled cello repertoire, obtaining the great masterpieces from Prokofiev, Shostakovich. And he was the first real sort of dissident musician who went against the system. How? He invited Solzhenitsyn to live at his dacha. It was a house outside of Moscow in Zhukovka. He didn't really have an apartment in Moscow to live or where he could write. There was a joke that I have not a doorman, but somebody like that, Nobel Prize winner of literature, because Solzhenitsyn was also given Nobel Prize. Rostropovich defends Solzhenitsyn. He writes that letter. That was a big breakthrough. I remember that famous triple concerto. Karajan invited the three greatest artists, Richter, Rostropovich, and Oyster, to play with Berlin Philharmonic, and they made a recording, of course. But before that, they played the same concerto with Svetlanov and the Russian State Orchestra in Moscow. And it was literally a couple of weeks after Rostropovich wrote that letter in defense of Solzhenitsyn. The hall was full as people were hanging from chandeliers. I mean, all the students were in every walkway. I mean, it was unbelievable. And the excitement. And they wouldn't come out for a long time. We were all looking if Solzhenitsyn's in the audience. No, he wasn't. If Sakharov is in the audience, also not. And then somebody joked, said, well, the reason it takes so long because they're taking off handcuffs of Rostropovich and they cannot do it. Of course, it was not exactly the truth, but the air was thick with anticipation. And when they finally came out, my God. And Rostropovich was the first musician who risked his career. And his career did suffer. He was not allowed to perform abroad. He was not promoted as he was before. So a year after Solzhenitsyn was let out of Russia, basically pushed out of Russia, Rostropovich had to leave. Rostropovich and his family. So it was a big, big loss, and also a big sign for all of us young musicians who were looking up to people like him. The politics were happening, right in front of us. So from then on, I started thinking about leaving Russia. But there was one more important piece that led me to that decision. I'm Dmitry Sitkovetsky. This podcast was produced by Libo Studio. And in the next episode, we'll meet my guru. In 1972, I told my best friend, at that time was Yura Rozum, I said, Yura, I will meet my guru tonight. We were very much into this whole Indian philosophy and the whole quasi-religious thing. And I did meet Guru, who was a very, as it turned out, paranoid, but at that time, to me, seemed incredibly different. And I, who didn't have a father since I was 3, obviously had a father void. So he filled that void to the point where I started basically living a double life.